And welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. I made a video the other day and we learned about Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret in their early days. Elizabeth was treated as an adult and Margaret was able to be more free, but she didn't like it because she felt that she was looked down on because she wasn't going to be queen one day. It resulted in jealousy, but their deep love continued, and Princess Elizabeth always felt like Princess Margaret was her baby. She said that the day that Margaret was born. So now let us continue on our journey and see what they are up to next. While Princess Elizabeth and her sister Princess Margaret were growing up, they lived for a time at Royal Lodge. It was there that they met Wallace Simpson for the first time. Uncle David had come to show off his custom-made American Buick station wagon and his new love from Maryland, Wallace Simpson. The Duke of York, he liked the station wagon, but he wasn't too sure about Wallace Simpson. At this time, Princess Elizabeth was 10 and Princess Margaret was 6. Their instructor brought them into the room, and the Duke introduced them as Lilibet and Margaret Rose. That's what Wallace Simpson remembered. They were wearing matching outfits, royal tartan kilt, and yellow pullovers. Wallace thought they were so blonde, so beautifully mannered, so brightly scrubbed, that they might have come straight from a picture book. When they watched them drive away, Elizabeth asked Crofty, "Who is she?" And the governess didn't answer, which confused them. Now we come to the abdication, and that meant changes for the Yorks. King Edward VIII abdicated the throne after 325 days of reign. He wanted to marry Wallace Simpson, a twice divorced American, which wasn't allowed at that time for a king to do so. Princess Margaret asked Allah, "Are they going to cut off his head?" She was scared. A crowd had gathered outside of 145 Piccadilly because now their father was going to be king in Edward VIII's place. When Lilibet woke up, she asked why the crowd was there, and the footman said that she was second in line to the throne after her father. Elizabeth went downstairs to tell her sister Margaret, and she asked her, "Does that mean you will have to be the next queen?" Elizabeth said, "Yes, someday." And Margaret said, "Poor you." So then on December the 10th, 1936, Elizabeth wrote in her diary that it was abdication day. She started to pray every night that a brother would be born to supersede her in the line of succession. So Margaret, being theatrical, said that now Papa is king, I am nothing. Then they were told that they would have to move to Buckingham Palace, and Margaret asked, "You mean forever?" Crofty told her yes, and then she told her, "You are no longer Margaret of York." Margaret asked, "Who am I?" And Crofty said that she was just Margaret. Margaret said, "But I have only just learned to write York. Now I'm nobody." Albert wasn't very happy about the situation either. He felt that what his brother David did was unforgivable. He confided to his cousin Dickie Mountbatten, "I never wanted this to happen." He said he was only a naval officer, and it was the only thing he knew. Because Albert had a stammer and other disabilities, it was thought that his younger brother, Prince George, might be on the throne, but that notion was soon discarded. The papers carried the news and also had portraits of Princess Elizabeth, and Margaret was just shown as part of a group of photos. Uncle David, who used to play with the girls, was no longer in their lives. They whispered about him, and then they didn't speak of him at all. Wallace was referred to as that woman, and it was never said in the sisters' presence. The girls at first curtsied to their father when he became king, but that was the only time they did it. Their father said to treat him as they did before he became king. For the coronation, their father picked out their outfits, and this was the first time that they would be wearing long dresses, and they both wore pearl necklaces and elbow-length fingerless white gloves. When they were being fitted, Margaret got mad when she saw that Elizabeth's train was an entire foot longer than hers. Their mother told her because Elizabeth was the oldest, she got the privilege. Margaret understood and didn't try to complain. The coronation. It was a gray, misty morning, and Elizabeth and Margaret were excited by the crowds that were gathering at the palace and along the mall. They were squealing and laughing and looking out of the windows. They rode in the blue and black Irish stagecoach to Westminster Abbey. They weren't allowed to face each other or to giggle. When they got to the Abbey, they were seated next to each other, and their grandmother was keeping an eye on them. They thought the ceremony would have Margaret getting bored, but Elizabeth was impressed by Margaret. She said she was so wonderful. I only had to nudge her once or twice when she played with her prayer books too loudly. Elizabeth enjoyed watching the pageantry. Margaret carried her cloak stylishly and got a little attention when she turned the pages of her book with purposeful force. The Queen Mother Elizabeth didn't notice. She was busy watching the ceremony. The move. They left Piccadilly, which was cozy, to a palace which was cold and impersonal. The new home was large. It took 5 minutes to walk from the girls' bedroom to the garden. There were 775 rooms and a staff of over 700. There was a man whose job it was to wind up all the clocks, and there was also a full-time florist. The girls had their own bedrooms, and Bobo shared with Elizabeth and Olive with Margaret. They were happy to have their rooms, but they were homesick. They wondered if there was a way to dig a tunnel back to Piccadilly. Now they couldn't spend as much time with their parents. They spent breakfast with them, and the nightly romps were a memory. It was like a glass wall between the royal family and the outside world. They didn't have friends outside their small circle. They would look out the window and at the crowd below. The sisters grew closer. They both still dressed alike, and this was a source of security and tension. Elizabeth started to mature more quickly after her father became king. She was 11 at this time, and she was interested in politics and political personalities. Margaret was more enthralled with the summertime garden parties being held on the palace lawns, and there was up to 3,000 people there. Elizabeth's studies started to include lessons in history and the Constitution with the vice provost of Eton College, Henry Martin. Margaret said she wanted to learn it too, but they said she didn't need to learn history, so she had lessons in music and dance. Margaret was bitter about not being able to learn what Elizabeth was learning. When she was an adult, she was self-taught, but she was scattered in her intellectual pursuits. She thought she would have enjoyed a richer, more orderly intellectual life if she'd been allowed to study more academic subjects when she was young. Elizabeth knew her sister was jealous, and one time Elizabeth had joined the first Buckingham Palace company of girl guides in 1937, and Margaret was too young to join. Elizabeth pleaded with the guide to let her join in. Elizabeth said, "She's very strong, you know, and that she loved getting dirty." A brownie pack was created with 14 youngsters, the daughters of palace employees and court officials, and this was done especially for Margaret. The girls went bird watching, erected tents, cooked sausages on an open fire, and slept under the canvas. Margaret loved sharing the tent with the other girls. Elizabeth, though, was shy, and she wasn't comfortable undressing in a group setting. Elizabeth was giving riding lessons at the Royal Lodge with Henry Owen, her father's groom. Elizabeth loved horse riding and solitary activity. Elizabeth's other teacher, Horace Smith, thought she was well suited for horsemanship because of her thoroughness and conscientious nature. But Margaret, she wasn't like that. Elizabeth was headed to puberty, and the king and the queen wanted Margaret to be the baby of the family for as long as possible. She wasn't told no very often, and her parents would laugh if she was naughty. And a funny story was told that one time when Margaret was 6, she was sent to her room for being rude. 2 hours later, she was sent to her mother's room, and her mother asked her, "I'm sure you are good now, aren't you?" And Margaret said, "No, I'm naughty still, and I'm going to keep on being naughty." Elizabeth was born with a sense of right and wrong. It was unsettled by how Margaret's rude behavior would look to people outside the immediate family circle. She would plead with her mom, "Stop her, Mummy. Oh, please stop her." Other times she would laugh at Margaret and the things she would do. Princess Elizabeth was like her mother. She would know how to defuse her father when he had outbursts. King George VI would get angry at things easily, from food being served the wrong temperature to a man walking by without removing his hat. Now we come to World War II. The Queen was afraid of being captured by the Germans and learned how to shoot a pistol in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. She took aim at rats flushed out from bombed-out buildings within the palace grounds. Her cousin Margaret Rhodes said that she thought if parachutists came down and whisked them away somewhere, she could take a parachutist or two with her. King George VI started carrying a rifle and a pistol in his car. He supervised the removal of the priceless crown jewels from the Tower of London to Windsor Castle. He and his trusted librarian, Owen Morshead, used borrowed tools to dismantle crowns, crosses, and diadems, and they wrapped them in waterproof bags and dumped them in the castle ponds. Later they were removed and wrapped in cotton wool, placed in hat boxes made of leather, and then placed in the castle dungeons. The king and queen tried to put on a brave front. They felt like there was impending doom, and when they appeared in public they would be calm and unruffled and defiant. Hitler said that the queen was the most dangerous woman in Europe because she managed to stir the people with patriotism and have the people support the defeat of the Nazi regime. So Buckingham Palace suffered 9 hits during the Blitz, and the king and the queen remained firm. The queen stated, "I am glad we've been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the eye," because the East End, for all this, was getting bombed a lot. Elizabeth and Margaret were sent to Scotland during the months of the Arab War, They spent time there riding horses and playing innocent games, and they even made the fitting a gas mask into a game. They were worried about their parents, and Margaret asked Coffey if the Germans were going to get them. They were supposed to stay there for a few days, but Elizabeth and Margaret ended up staying in Scotland for the rest of the war. There were grenadier guards that were protecting the castle, and the castle was governed by a bell warning system. If the bell sounded, they had to go to air raid shelters in the dungeons. 2 nights after they got there, they had a bell go off. Their new lives weren't the usual way they were used to living. They lived in cold and drafty rooms, and at bath time, hot water was strictly rationed, lights were low voltage or non existent, and their meals were prepared under the ration book. And drills were being done regularly. The sisters could feel the vibrations of bombs hitting London 15 miles away. Margaret remembered the enemy aircraft always seemed to come over when they had just got to sleep. If the bell sounded, they had to get up, throw on some clothes, grab their tiny suitcases containing their prized possessions, and go down to the damp-smelling sleeping quarters. And to show how compassionate Elizabeth was, when she heard the news of a German submarine that had penetrated the defenses of the northern naval base at Scapa Flow and sunk the Royal Oak battleship with over 800 lives lost, she jumped up and said to Coffey, "It can't be. All those nice sailors." And it happened on October the 14th, 1939. When Christmas came, the tragedy was still on her mind, and she told Coffey, "Perhaps we were too happy. I kept thinking of those sailors and what Christmases must have been like in their homes." The princesses at this time started to have vegetable gardens in the grounds. They learned to knit socks and gloves for the war effort, but Elizabeth, she had a little bit of trouble with the knitting part. And they continued French lessons. So Margaret resented the lack of education, and she blamed her mother for it. The king taught Elizabeth about the red box, which contained top secret letters, confidential state papers, and other vital documents that had to be reviewed, approved, and signed. And Princess Margaret, she would be sitting there silently knitting. A friend of the sisters said the royal family, they were as four people who mean everything to each other, whose lives form one spiritual whole, independently of the aid of all outsiders or even relations. And another entry, she said the sisters were happier alone with their parents than with anyone else on earth. So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, we learned how the York family's way of life changed forever when Edward VIII decided to leave the throne in order to be with the woman he loved. He was also a bit overwhelmed with his responsibilities, so that was another reason he decided to go. Prince Albert, the Duke of York, never wanted to be king and was afraid when he took the responsibility. He said he was a naval officer, and that's all he knew. He became King George VI and did a great job in keeping the spirits of the country optimistic during England's most trying times. Princess Margaret and Elizabeth had to be sent to Scotland, but things weren't the same as they had been at the palace. They did have some good times, though, and they still had each other. In the next episode, we'll return to see how the sisters got through the war and what happened with them after that. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.